Hello, welcome to Pressure Point. I'm your host, Valerie Dudoward. Our topic this program, and the title of our program, is A Safe and Welcoming Place. And I'd like to welcome my guest for this program, Freda Enns, Director of the Vancouver Police Native Liaison Society. Welcome, Freda.
Thank you.
Vancouver Police Native Liaison Society is a nonprofit society that is responsible and has a mandate to a very, very important service that's located in the downtown east side of Vancouver.
Yes.
What service is provided by the Storefront and by the society?
We're a specialized victim assistance program. We work with victims and witnesses of crime. We work with anything from murder, manslaughter, historical sexual assault, spousal assault, anything. And our support workers, they work from the beginning of a case right to the very end through the court accompaniment, everything.
Policing, especially I think for the Aboriginal community, is a very significant issue, whether the Aboriginal community is located in a city such as Vancouver or in a town or in a reserve community. And I think because I work for the Native court workers, I'm familiar with the amount of times and in the courts in Vancouver say that Aboriginal people continue to be in conflict with the law and also continue to be victims of various crimes. How would it be different for an Aboriginal person to report a crime through the service that you provide rather than going directly through whatever regular channels exist?
Well, because when they come to our office and everything is explained, a lot of times they come in and they think that especially if they've been a victim, that automatically the police may come in and want to question them or whatever. And if they don't know what the process is and if they have information, the staff are able to help them in either having our liaison unit, our 2 constables, take a report, or contacting whichever police officers are involved in the case and helping them through that and explaining the whole system to them and support, because especially like say for instance in a sexual assault case where to come forward in a case like that would be very traumatic and they may be disowned or anything, by families, that to know that there's someone there for them right through the whole process is very important. And so that's some of what we do.
The society has operated as Storefront and provided services to the Aboriginal community for a number of years. How did the society come about?
Well, in 1981, the Vancouver Police Department and members of the Native community had begun having meetings and seeing where the Native community, the victims and witnesses of crime were falling through the gaps. They weren't making reports, they weren't following through, and that. So then they formed the Native Liaison Unit, which was the 2 constables. And then in April 1st of 1991, they opened the Storefront Project, which was the first project in Canada like this. And so since then, we've just sort of grown into what we are today.
The Storefront itself, I guess, reminds me of a lot of what I read about in the papers and what I see walking about any community in Vancouver, which is the really big emphasis on community policing that we see everywhere. Is this a type of that kind of philosophy, or is this different?
Well, it's a type in a way, but I think it's even more because our constables are very committed and they care a lot. And in Vancouver, their mandate is 64 different Native organizations, as well as Musqueam, Squamish, Burrard bands, etc. if they're called upon, and they'll follow a case right through as well in supporting in that. And And so if there's a case, say we have a historical sexual assault from Prince Rupert, maybe, they'll work with Prince Rupert on that case and work with the victims, and we'll also assist the victims as well.
For those kinds of cases, which have significance to the Aboriginal community, in part because of our history to do with residential school, for example, is there a statute of limitations around how far back you can go in your history to bring a case or to bring a complaint against somebody?
With child molesting, especially if you're a child and it happens, there's no statute of limitations on child molesting. So that's why we've had a lot of historical sexual abuse cases, and now the residential school and that. So.
Mm-hmm. The residential school experience, which maybe some viewers might not be too familiar with, really had to do with not only policy but legislation that required status Aboriginal children to attend schools and live in schools, often far from their communities, away from their parents, and that really marked at least one generation, and in some communities 2 or more generations of Aboriginal people with trauma that resulted from things like being punished for speaking or attempting to speak their Aboriginal languages. And there was a major report that came out recently on Aboriginal people, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and there was a quote from that I think really speaks to that kind of philosophy, which is that what the government, and in some cases along with the church agencies, were trying to do was to take the Indian out of the child, and that was one of the quotes from that report. Do you, in your work at the Storefront, and I know your work in the community, see that?
Yeah, sad to say we see it. That's one of our really sad situations that we see a lot, is child apprehension. And I don't know if a lot of people realize, and it was kind of a shock for us to find out, because we hadn't known either, is that when First Nations child is apprehended by the Ministry of Social Services, and Morris had a run-in one time in one of our meetings with Social Services, and that is when this Matthew Woodrow situation all happened in the Gove Inquiry, and they were talking about the new legislation, and he asked them, he said, when you apprehend a white child, who do you get reimbursed from? Who reimburses you? Well, their answer was, well, sometimes we get it from the parents, sometimes we just have to write it off. So he asked, like with the Asian community, etc. And same thing, you know, sometimes they write it off and sometimes they get it reimbursed. But with the First Nations community, 100% of the dollars for when they apprehend a First Nations child is repaid by the Department of Indian Affairs. And so we see like a high percentage of our children, and you look at statistics where 75% of the children on the streets today are First Nations kids. Many of these kids that we work with and have worked with are First Nations kids that grew up in the foster care system and lost their identity, and so it was almost like they took us from, you know, went from the residential school and now to the Ministry of Social Services that control our lives. And I think working in this job, the saddest time for us that we see is Mother's Day and Christmas, because so many of our moms have had their children apprehended and have had it, you know, automatically. You know, the one is apprehended, the next one is apprehended, and you know, so that's a reality, you know.
The area that the Storefront is located in, and for a time the Storefront was separate from the actual police building on Main Street as a separate storefront, standalone service, and has relocated now. What is that neighborhood like for people who aren't familiar with the downtown east side of Vancouver?
Well, it can be pretty scary if you're not used to that area. Because it is right in the heart of Skid Row. You see a lot of drug addicts. There's a lot of alcoholics and that in the area. There's a lot of violence. Like one of the girls that worked at Native Court Workers one time, she was assaulted or robbed with a used needle, you know, and I mean that's become a part of our reality down here. Is you have to be very careful, and so if you don't know the area, you know, you got to be very careful.
What led you to do the kind of work that you do, to be responsible for such a critical service in what is often referred to as the poorest neighborhood in Canada?
Mine came out of life experience. I graduated from the Family Violence and Community Counseling Program through Native Education Center, but before that I had been a victim of childhood sexual abuse as well, and going through the justice system with that, and I want to explain that it wasn't out of revenge or anything that we did it. It was because there were more children at risk that we were concerned about, and so we took our perpetrator to court, and going through the system, you know, 3 times before it ever went to court, it was dead filed, and it was really frustrating, and then to find out that there was no statute of limitations on child molesting, and that there shouldn't be any reason why. We went through the process and through the whole court system. You know, and to have comments made when we were in court, it happened in Vancouver here that we went through court, you know, like, oh, let's keep in mind, Your Honor, we're not dealing with second-class citizens here, you know, or we're talking about second-class citizens here. And it was really, you know, demeaning, you know, because, you know, and for the judge to say, well, you know, because we were Native and the offenses occurred on reserve, we should be judged under different laws. You know, those kinds of comments and things. It was really scary experience, not knowing, and so I think when we went through it, and my sisters were having a really difficult time, and there was no support, and I thought, like, that's where there was a need, you know, was that kind of support, and then through my training and that, it just happened that, you know, I was recommended for my job. And
is there any story that stands out in your mind of, you know, of the many, I don't know how many clients and individuals that the Storefront has assisted, but I know of several personally. Is there any one that really stands out in your mind?
Well, you know, I could go on all night, like there are many, but I think, well, just to give you a kind of an idea, over a 10-month period, we had 7,730 calls and walk-ins for service, and with a staff of 3, like that's a pretty heavy caseload. And when Morris and Marilyn are given a case for assisting in court, they follow it right through. And when I was a support worker, that's what I did. And one of the cases that I worked on was a murder trial, and it was I don't know if you're familiar with the case with Cheryl Ann Joe. When she was found in Vancouver here, she was mutilated and cut up. Her body parts were left, and through that whole trial and working with the family to see how a family could go through such horror and sit through that trial, and yet at the end of it to say they wanted to do something very special to honor the people that had helped them through that case. And Robert Davidson had been hosting a 2-day urban feast, and he gave the family time in that ceremony, and they did their honoring ceremony, and they invited each one of the police officers, the detectives, the Crown prosecutor and his assistant, the pathologist, and it was just totally awesome. One of our constables, Jay Johns, he was one of the constables that was honored, and he was the only one in uniform that night, and it was at the Aboriginal Friendship Center. And we estimated about 1,100 people there, 12 different tribes. And when Jay went forward, as when each of the people that were honored went forward and received their eagle feathers, which in our Native tradition is the highest honor you can receive, the place just, you know, everybody was just clapping and yelling and everything. And when Jay went forward, that was just like the place went wild. And I think that, like Robert said, it was one of the the first time in history that the justice system and the Native community had come together in such a positive way. And I think for myself, working with that case and working with that family and all of that horror, and for them to let something so special come out of that, I think was a real special for me.
Thank you for sharing that, and to the family for, I know, feeling okay about your sharing that with our viewers. The Storefront Operation, when it started in the early 80s, had a funding formula that included the Attorney General, the City of Vancouver, and there was one other
The Federal Solicitor
agent,
General.
the Federal Solicitor General. And that's changed over the time. What kind of situation is the Storefront in now?
Well, we, right now, our funding is basically from the Attorney General. We get $80,000, and in the past it had been shared by the Attorney General, the City of Vancouver, and the Sol Gen. The Solicitor General pulled out after 3 years because they don't fund ongoing, and then the City of Vancouver pulled out, saying that, well, we've always had a problem that we didn't belong anywhere. You know, they feel that because we're First Nations we could go to Department of Indian Affairs, but you know, we can't. We're not on reserve, even though we work with Native people from all over. So right now we only, through the Attorney General of Vancouver, so we basically are looking at a 1/3 of our funding cut. And so that's pretty frustrating, and, you know.
If people from the community in general, because I think it's more than the Aboriginal people of the community of Vancouver, but the community of Vancouver who has a stake and an interest in this issue. If people want to lend assistance to ensure that this service is able to continue, you know, in a way that's going to continue to be effective, what can the average person do?
Well, we, you know, if letters of support are very important, we do take volunteers, we do take students, and, you know, like if they could, like I say, the letters of support are important for our funders, and to show that we do have that need out there, and for people to say, you know, like that it is a very needed service, which, you know, it's not just because it's my job, but because there are people there that really depend on us, and you know, and especially with the situation as it is, with a lot of our people dying today of AIDS and HIV, there's a lot of those people that we work with, drug addicts, prostitutes, etc., that come in, and we're kind of like a family, and they depend on us being there, you know, just kind of an extended family, because many of their families are somewhere else and aren't there for them. So
those are ways that people can be helpful. And I think going back to the title that we chose for this program and for our discussion, it really speaks to what you've just shared about the way that the Aboriginal community really views the service that you provide, because it's not only a place where people can feel more comfortable getting access to their rights to report crimes, to identify themselves as being victims of crimes, survivors of historical sexual abuse, but it really offers a service, if you want to call it that, that is way beyond that.
I think, if you don't mind my sharing, I was just thinking of one of our, well, actually two of our clients that were prostitutes and had worked the area for many years, and they came in and got to know us, and they wanted just basically to go in their files that they'd had bad dates. And as we worked with them, and our philosophy is you don't judge. You don't judge. You don't know what they've gone through, and that's not our place. And so as I was talking to them, I said, but why don't you want to make a police report? Like, why don't you want to? Well, who's really going to give a shit, you know? But we do, and you have a right. That's a right. You know, you're a human being. And both those girls went to court, and each of them charged their Johns. And I went with one girl, and a constable and a detective went with another girl. And I sat in the courtroom with her, and when the defense lawyer says to her, "But you're just a hooker. You know, don't you, isn't this expected? You get paid for it." And she sat up and she said, "No, I'm a human being. And, you know, no human being deserves that." I got a phone call from the detective later that was working with the other girl, because they were on the same day. And she said she could have gone through the roof, she says, because when the defense lawyer, same thing, "But you're just a prostitute." And the girl sat forward and she said, "All my life I've been abused, and all my life I lived with abuse, and you tell me now that just because I'm a prostitute, I'm to expect it? Well, I'm a human being, and no human being deserves that." And I think it's things like that that really make our job special. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm. Make it really, really worth going in every single day. I'm really familiar with the area that the storefront is located in, and I've worked in this neighborhood on and off for quite a few years in Vancouver. And I think something that I've noticed, and I wonder how significant it is to your program, is that the neighborhood really has changed in some ways. There was a time when I would and did feel, in general, much safer walking down the streets than I would necessarily today. And I think that times have really gotten tough, and times are always tough there, but when times are tough everywhere, then it's definitely, experienced in that neighborhood. What do you think is really different today?
I think a lot of it is the politics, and I think financially, the way the economy is, the way I know a lot of the cutbacks with the welfare system and those kinds of things have made it very tough. Lack of housing, shortage of housing, and especially now with all the AIDS and HIV, we see people that live in the most horrendous living conditions that really need specialized care and just like Morris is working now with an elderly man that we're concerned it's gangrene, but he lives in a dive hotel where he can't even soak his feet, and those kinds of situations that are appalling, and so I think a lot of that is things that politicians really need to look at, and I think get your priorities straight first is one thing.
The HIV and AIDS reality within the Aboriginal community. I remember a few years ago, maybe more than a few, 6 or 7 years ago, I had been at a conference around the HIV, AIDS, and the Aboriginal community, and I think that for a time, perhaps some of our elected leadership and other leaders in the community really didn't recognize or weren't grasping what a huge impact this was going to have in our community as a whole, whether we're talking about the city, on reserve, and especially the population that migrates back and forth between the city and the reserve communities and the towns. And certainly I see it every day when I'm going through or into or past the downtown East Side area in particular. It's absolutely devastating our community.
I think you see the destruction like we see it, and it's so sad, where they come down there and they're beautiful girls, and then within weeks they're full of sores and they're just look old and used, and it's sad, it's really sad, and I think for myself, if there's people out there that know you've got loved ones down in those situations, and that is like one of the girls that she went to court against her John. She's been one of our girls that's been missing for over a year, and it took us about 3 months to get a missing persons on her, because family hadn't kept in contact and those kinds of things, and we weren't family. But I think it's really important is for people to keep in touch and just let them know that they do matter. And I think with the media, you know, when you see articles and things like that about our girls when they are murdered, instead of putting up with articles or, you know, headlines, you know, native hooker murdered, or, you know, prostitute or Skid Row woman slain, those kinds of things, I don't think they realize when they're putting those kinds of articles in the paper that those women do have people that do love them. They are someone's sister, they're someone's mother, and we've dealt with families that have been just destroyed by those articles. There are children years later dealing with articles some person wrote that you know, it was just a catchy headline, but those kids deal with it for years later. And I think when people start to read those articles, and if you say, look, I'm not putting up with that, there is a press council, there are ways to stop those articles, and you know, people, because these people are human beings, and I think that people need to realize that
there are individual personalities and real lives behind some headlines splashed in the paper, and I think sometimes it's so easy not to look beyond that with any depth and realize, as you do with such compassion, that unless we take care of every person in our community at whatever level, socioeconomic or otherwise, that they're at, then we're not really acting as a community.
I think they need to stop and think, like, what brought her to that place, or him, even the young boys that we have out there, what brought them to those places? Why are they there today? You know, a lot of it isn't by their own choice, it's by them making, you know, people not being able to get food, money for food and things like that. So
I really appreciate the energy and commitment that you put into your work, Freda Enns. This has been Pressure Point. I'm your host, Valerie Dudoward. Thank you for joining us.